Well, the arrival of a baby is usually a moment of pure joy, but in Australia, every year, more than 2,000 births are a tragedy when the child is stillborn. Across Australia, there is a uniform definition. Stillbirths is when a fetus is older than 20 weeks. Earlier than that, it's called a miscarriage. But now, in one state, that definition is under review in a move that could reopen the long and fraught debate over abortion. Mike Sexton reports.
This was one of my kids. Yep. You know, we'd planned everything for him and felt him kick and heard his heartbeat and watched him on the ultrasound sucking his little thumb, and yeah, he was, you know, going to be part of our family.
In the week before Christmas last year, Talia Barch received the worst news an expecting mother could hear, that her child's heart had stopped beating. As she was in her second trimester of pregnancy, Talia Barch went to hospital where she was induced and after 9 hours of labour delivered her stillborn son, Jaden. And
we held on to him for 5 amazing and heartbreaking hours, and then, said goodbye to him and handed him to the nurse and watched him walk out the room, which was very hard.
In the days that followed the autopsy, Talia Barch and her husband and their 4-year-old son held a memorial service for Jaden. At their home, there's a collection of precious mementos, but what isn't among them is a birth certificate. Across Australia, a stillborn child can only receive a birth certificate if the death occurs after 20 weeks. Talia Barch was a few days shy of that 20-week mark.
I was warned at the hospital about angry grief. I woke up one morning and I was in my angry grief, and I put a comment on Facebook about how to upset a grieving mum, and why don't you just tell her that she can't have a birth certificate for her child and that they never existed, even though he always will to us.
The comment touched a raw nerve, and her inbox was flooded with similar stories. The Barches are from Port Lincoln, a fishing and grain town on South Australia's Eyre Peninsula, and soon hundreds of its residents signed a petition seeking change to the law.
Using this MOI to speak on what is known now as Jaden's Law initiative, which is an initiative that a very brave mother, who many of my colleagues would be aware of, Talia Barch, has raised with us.
Family First MP Robert Brokenshire has introduced legislation in South Australia's upper house to lower the 20-week threshold to 12 weeks.
We just think it's fair and reasonable that the mother, the father and any other siblings have a right to legal recognition of the stillbirth via a birth certificate for that infant.
If South Australia's Parliament passes the law, it will be the lowest formal recognition of when life begins in the country, and so the other states will be watching closely.
What the South Australian Amendment shows is that there is a strong view in the community, it may well be the majority view, that the law has not kept up with medical and social practice. So for other states to consider it would be entirely appropriate.
Former New South Wales Premier Christina Keneally is patron of the Stillbirth Foundation of Australia. She has 2 sons, but in between them was a daughter, Caroline, who was stillborn, just shy of 20 weeks into the pregnancy.
It is a hole, if you will, for me, that a hole in our lives, that her life hasn't been recognised with a birth certificate. I would have made that decision to wait a few days just to have that recognition.
Robert Brokenshire believes the 12-week mark also reflects medical advances, that much more is known about a fetus at 12 weeks, and that the law should reflect that.
I have a personal view on when an infant becomes an infant, and that's well before 12 weeks. But when we listen to the people that we consulted with across the spectrum, the common agreement was that there needs to still be a date and that 12 weeks was an acceptable date.
The question being asked is, could the issuing of a birth certificate, and with it the legal recognition of life at 12 weeks, change the access women currently have to abortion? There are some very strongly held opinions on this by pro-choice MPs, but none agreed to an interview with 7:30, with one remarking this legislation isn't going anywhere, we've had this debate and we don't want it back on the agenda.
Well, the concern that would be around in that area is that even though it seems like it's not connected to abortion rights or abortion legislation, in fact, in other states and across the world, when changes are made in legislation that seem to be disconnected from a concern about abortion rights, they very quickly are used as a means of trying to restrict women's access to abortion.
Leslie Knold is an ethicist who has researched and written on women's rights and reproductive health for over 20 years. She says increasingly pro-life activists are seeking incremental changes to the law that can later be exploited to restrict women's access to terminations.
Later on, those very same pro-life activists who put it there in the first place will turn around to the legislators and say, well, this is inconsistent. You know, it doesn't make any sense. Over here, you're saying that at 12 weeks, a fetus is a person enough to get a birth and a death certificate. So isn't it entirely inconsistent that we have abortion laws that allow termination at that stage?
I've only had one person that's been very strong in their message to me that, you know, I'm trying to bring some trick into this to deal with those that are pro-abortion and trying to pull back from their stance. That is not true.
The only precedent is in the Northern Territory, where a similar amendment was defeated in 2008. But Christina Keneally believes there's a way through the politics.
It's possible they can implement this, and the way they can do that is by people on both the left and the right not trying to make this amendment into something that it's not. This amendment purely seeks to recognise the birth of a child between 12 and 20 weeks, and if the parents want it recognised legally.
For Talia Barch, such battles are beyond her. She isn't a politician, she's a mother who sought to find some meaning in her son's death and potentially extend that to others who may suffer a similar trauma.
He might not ever receive a birth certificate, but the fact that his name, I suppose, will live on, whether it gets passed or not. He's a special little boy and he's not even here to enjoy it.